So, all right, here we go. Let's get the party started. All right, my name is Marc Isaacson. I'm vegan triathlete. That's where you can find me online. I am a Drupal freelancer. I've been doing this since 2010. And where you can find me online, you can find me on Drupal.org at Vegan Triathlete. You can find me on GitHub at Vegan Triathlete, and you can find, my company, my freelance company, at isaacsonwebdevelopment.com. I've been doing it since 2010, and I am still doing it because I love it, because I think it's awesome. I love the whole open source community, the open source tools. I love Drupal. I love doing web development. It's always interesting. And the way that I do it is that, as I mentioned, for those of you who were in there earlier, I'm a code monkey. I'm a back-end guy. I don't like pushing pixels. I don't like being on the client side and the front end. I love doing stuff on the back end. That's where I really thrive. Give me a chance to interact with the computer and write some code, and I'm good. So about you, who I'm expecting in the audience, is that it's totally fine for you to be a beginner Drupal 8 developer. I don't assume that you have any experience with Drupal 8. I don't assume that you have any experience with Drupal at all. What I'm expecting is that you're looking to get a handle on things overall, how they're done here. And when you want to do it is like immediately, if not sooner, to start getting your head around these things. And you can start doing that right at this presentation, because I am going to cover like a lot of these fundamental things that once you kind of get it into your head, it should really bring you up to speed. And why you want to do it, as I mentioned when I was kind of just talking to you in general here, is that you're not just learning Drupal now. You're actually learning a lot about web development best practices, and you're going to make yourself more marketable as well. So even if you kind of decide that you don't like the Drupal community or whatever, learning this stuff is going to give you the opportunity to take things elsewhere. Just as I mentioned, we are going to be looking at some code snippets today. There will be code in this presentation. That's how we're going to start bringing you up to speed. So, I've said that I've pared this down as much as I can while still giving you all the fundamentals. So I've had to keep things at a fairly high level. This is a brief introduction to the things that you need to know, and it's mostly focused on when you recognize these types of patterns, you're going to be able to use them all over the place, and that's what's going to make you more productive. What it isn't is going to be this encyclopedic tour de force, getting into every little nook and cranny, explaining how you do every edge case you can possibly run into. So, it's getting you the idea of how you go about doing this stuff. You may have your own particular use cases, like, but what if I wanted to... All right, we don't have time to discuss all that little stuff here, so let's keep it focused on, understanding that, like, this is geared more towards, like, this is going to get you up to speed. You can dig into all the other interesting nooks and crannies a little bit later on. So, having told you all of that, and I'm so happy to see so many people in the room, it's lovely to speak to a large audience, I still do want to give you the opportunity, though, if that sounds good, if that sounds like what you came here for, and if it doesn't seem like it's what you came here for and you're not willing to play along, I won't be too hurt and too offended if you wanted to get up and leave and go someplace else right now and find a presentation that was going to be more to your liking. But just want to make sure that we're all playing the same game here. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7. Okay, I counted to 7. Nobody got up and left, so we're going to be good to go. All right, so the presentation is called OOP, Design Patterns in Drupal 8. So, like, what am I talking about? What am I going to cover on OOP here? I'm going to talk about things like interfaces, classes, abstract classes, traits, dependency injection, services. These are all OOP types of concepts. What I'm not going to talk about is, like, anybody who knows anything about doing PHP would only do things this way, and if you do it any differently, then you're a complete idiot and you don't deserve to call yourself a web. We're not getting into all those flame wars, because there's, and specifically one of the things that we'll see later on is that traits are one of those things that in the PHP community, not everybody is totally in love with them. So we're not going to get into these arguments about, like, are traits a good thing or are traits not a good thing. There's something that's used in Drupal, and it's important for you to know about it. When I'm talking about design patterns, I'm going to be talking about things like how Drupal does stuff with YAML, how Drupal does things with services and their plugins and the service container. What I'm not going to be getting into is like if you know about the gang of four and they're like, oh, this is the decorator pattern and this is the, you know, Drupal does actually use some of those gang of four design patterns and how the framework operates right now. But I'm focusing on what the patterns are that Drupal uses repeatedly. So I'm not going to be getting into the specifics like, oh, this is using the factory, like, not those patterns. It's like, this is Drupal-y. You know, how does Drupal implement this stuff here? When I'm talking about Drupal 8, we're looking at code and examples of how you can get up running and doing things. But we're not going to be talking about, oh, this is what a user is, and this is what a role is, and here's how you implement permissions. And if you wanted to build something you could do with views, this isn't site building type of stuff. This is, we're focusing specifically on code. Multilingual is awesome in Drupal 8. They've made it so much easier, but we're not talking about that in this presentation. So that gives you an idea of what I mean when I'm saying OOP, design patterns in Drupal 8. That could open up a really big world, and I've chosen to focus it on these types of things. Okay, so right now, the way I'm going to be teaching you things is I've actually written a module that's running this presentation, and you're looking at this module in action right now, and that's most of the code samples that we're going to look at is that I have in the module. So if you were interested in actually being able to pull this down and play with it and see the things that I'm talking about, you can go to my GitHub repository and you can pull down this module that's called presentation. And there actually is a contributed module on Drupal.org for Drupal 6 that's called presentation, which took us, then they never ported it to Drupal 7. And they've taken a different approach. So I actually do want this to become a module in the contrib space at some point, but it's not like, I haven't finished, I haven't written any tests, and there's some things that I think could be done to improve it. But I do welcome you. Please pull it down, play with it, go to the GitHub repository, file issues against it, file pull requests or whatever, so that we can turn this module itself into something that makes it kind of fun to do presentations using Drupal 8 instead of like using you know, some of the different JavaScript things that they do or whatever. This is running on my machine locally right now. Some people asked about that. So getting to that point, if you go to my GitHub repository, you will actually find another repository that's called OOP-design patterns-Drupal 8. And you can actually run this presentation on your machine as well. You know, fire up a local instance, pull down the GitHub repository. I've got the database in there, and you can actually run through this presentation on your own. So that's another thing. Like, you don't have to really worry about taking too many notes. I don't have slides on SlideShare, but you've got the repo that you can pull onto your machine, and you can actually run this presentation yourself. So go to the GitHub repo, and you can get those things and have lots of fun. So a high-level look of some of the things that we are going to be talking about. When I'm talking about the patterns, there's info files that you use. You need them for themes, you need them for modules. Nothing is going to happen until you have an info file, because you need to have something that you enable in the interface. We're going to look at services. Services are so powerful that pretty much any business logic should end up going into services. Your containers, your controllers, you know, any things that you're going to be doing that ends up presenting stuff to the user, like those should be really thin and light. Any of your complex logic should end up, your business rules, all that stuff should really end up in a service, which makes them reusable, and it also, by putting things in services, it makes it more unit testable as well. So we're going to look at services. We're going to be looking, routing is what's replaced hook menu. So we'll get a chance to see an example of the routing file. I've done a tiny bit of stuff that actually I did need to use for this module that I've written for the presentation, where we're dealing with the libraries. And I did end up needing to write a .module file. In Drupal 8, it's actually possible for you to write a module without ever having to write a .module file anymore. And really the only thing that you end up needing in .module files is, because there's still some hook implementations. Not everything has been converted to events and dispatchers and subscribers, so when you need to do a hook, this, that, or the other thing, it ends up in your .module file. So we will have a look at a .module file. So Speaking of those things, all of those files that I've mentioned right now, the particular files, they live in the, so there's the first thing to know about how Drupal 8 is organized. There's certain stuff that goes in your root directory of your module, and I'm still struggling with what to call it. I don't like to call it modules anymore. I'd actually prefer to see us call them libraries, kind of using the idea, like they were writing things in a way that you could almost take what you're writing and you could use it as a library in somebody else's project, and they can use your thing in there. We've called them modules before because you always had this .module file, but we don't even necessarily need that anymore now. So like, I don't really love calling it a module, but for lack of a better name and for lack of talking with people in the community to see what are we going to call them, we're still calling them modules. So I'm saying in your modules root folder is where you put these files that I mentioned. You've got your info file, which is what exposes your module to Drupal. And then you have, for your library management, you've got your libraries YAML. The .module I'm saying is mostly used if you've got hook implementation. Your routing files, what's taken the place of anything that you did with hook menu. Your services is what declares your services if you've written, but your services actually go under the source directory. So this is your first look at when you're doing stuff with modules, like what you're going to typically see in the root level of your module. So let's move on, since I've been going on about services a bit here. So I said services they're so powerful, and this is where you do most of your work with any of your business logic that you're writing in a module. And you really need to be thinking about anything that you want to be used elsewhere is probably going to go into a service. There's very little that you should be dropping into your various classes that you're writing. They should tend to be pretty thin. So what about these services? How do we use these things? Well, you've already seen services in action in my presentation right now, because you see that there's these links that I can get from one slide to the next. I can go to the previous slide, I can go to the next slide. There's a service that I call so that I know what links I'm supposed to be doing here on a given slide. We've also seen on the front page, which I had up there for a while, there was this table of contents. I've got a service that's generating the table of contents, and the controller that actually builds this page is calling that service. So the logic isn't in the controller just calls a method, and it gets its table of contents back that it needs. We have got, so there's a place where we're seeing it. So this whole idea now of how we do things with services is, and this is important, when you're going to create a service, you really want to have an interface that it implements. And we're going to talk more about interfaces actually on the next slide. If you saw my next link there, I said Wherefore are our interfaces. So we'll get more into interfaces in a little bit. But so this is what you end up doing to create a service. A service ends up being a class. And the way that we organize things in Drupal 8 now is the idea is that each file contains one class. Don't put multiple classes in a file. And then each class should also be highly focused so that you don't try to do tons of stuff in that one class. So when we're creating our services, we're going to have a file, and we've got this concept of namespaces that we use in Drupal. And I'm not really going to get into namespacing now, but the key thing about namespacing is that this is what really prevents you from having to worry about having collisions with anything else. In previous versions of Drupal, you needed to name your module, you needed to name your functions and things so that you wanted to make sure that this function didn't, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Because now we have namespaces. And it doesn't matter if you've got a method that has the exact same name as something else because it lives in a different namespace. And so you don't have to get these crazy, long kind of... Methods is what we're writing now when we're in classes. But it's actually a function is what you're putting in that you attach to your class. So namespaces take care of that. So our services exist right under the... it's in the source directory inside of your namespace there. So you create this class, this file, that's going to implement an interface, and then you put your logic that is going to help you do the things that you need to do. So to have an example of a specific, so we aren't being too abstract here, I mentioned that that first page you looked at has a table of contents. Well, what I have also available, if you download the module and look at it, there's also a block where you can display your table of contents. I haven't placed that block in my presentation, but they use the same service. They make a call to this method, this create table of contents method, and then they get the stuff back that they need so that they know what are all the slides in this presentation. So there it is. I mean, that's a service that you're seeing right there. It's not actually all that complicated. It's not really that scary. It's a class that you put in a file that provides certain methods, and then you can call those methods from other places in your application, and now you're making use of services. So pretty simple concept to be able to put into use. Okay, other methods that I made available. I showed you. We got the previous slide, we've got the next slide. It's a method that we call in our service so we can figure out, like, what's the link that's supposed to go here when I'm on this one. And finally, you're seeing these I've got this block here that holds these images that I can click and then they open up in the modal here. Well, I've got the method that provides me what are the images that are associated with this slide that I'm looking at. So all of this stuff is done through my slide presentation manager service. Like it's all in its own little place, easy to know where to find it, easy to be able to digest it. But then where it's used in other places, I'm just calling the service and using those methods. So you're seeing services in use all over the place already, right in this presentation. And it's.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Please ask questions.
If you could point out what patterns are due to Symfony while you're going through this, that would be useful. Or how many are just D8 kind of architectural elements that exist.
Sure.
That would help me.
Okay.
Thank you.
Services are pretty much a Symfony thing that's being utilized because Symfony provides the service container. So we are leveraging the Symfony framework so that we can put things into services. Having said that, though, services is an object-oriented programming concept. So it's not necessarily that Symfony came up with the idea of services. You will use this in modern web development all over the place. So it's a Symfony thing, and it's more a conceptual way that you do web development right now. And it's definitely not just a Drupal 8 thing right now. So that gives you your answer with services right there. And most of this stuff that I'm going to tell you about really is either Symfony or object-oriented programming concepts. Almost nothing that I'm going to talk about here is something like, oh, this is just specific to Drupal 8. And that's what I was saying. It's so nice about Drupal 8 now that you're not learning just Drupal-y stuff anymore that only applies to Drupal. What you're learning, like, you take it outside. You can do it anywhere else. So I mentioned the interfaces. And what you saw when I showed you how we define our service is that it implements this interface. So what is an interface then? And we'll talk more about why we want to use interfaces when we look at dependency injection. But what an interface is pretty much, it's the blueprint or the contract that you agree to. And any class that implements any interface must implement those methods that are defined in the interface. And so the benefit of having an interface is that people know what to expect. They don't have to read through your code to know how they're going to use it. They just look at the interface and they say, oh, cool. There's this create table of contents method that I'm going to have available to me. I think I might need to create a table of contents. They don't need to dig into all the code to figure out where was that, how does it work. They just look at the interface and like, oh, I have an idea what this does. So they're also kind of like a form of documentation because they're very readable even for non-technical people. They don't have to get blown away by like digging through all of this code. And so you can look at them quite easily to understand what's going on, and they're really the key to what makes dependency injection work. If you don't use an interface, you kind of blow away the whole notion of dependency injection because you use your interface to type hint your arguments that are getting injected into your object. They get injected through the constructor. And if you type hint with a class, for instance, PHP is going to make sure that you actually have an instance of that class, and that's the only thing it's going to accept. Well, now you just shot yourself in the foot, because if you want your functionality to be different than what's in that class, you have to hack that class. If you use an interface, anything that implements that interface can be injected. So you can do your, like, you might not like the way that I built the table of contents. You might say, Mark's an idiot, his table of contents sucks. I'm going to write my own presentation manager service. It's cool because you just need to implement my interface, and then there's a way that you can override the services that are in use in Drupal, and now your presentation manager service gets injected into my controller, my blocks or whatever, and it all just works. You didn't have to hack the class. You didn't have to change anything with the application, but it's because of the magic of using interfaces. So important that you want to be using interfaces instead of using specific classes. And then when you define your own services, that you make sure that you've created an interface as well that you implement. This is a big pattern all over the place in Drupal 8 is interfaces. So what an interface ends up looking like, it's placed in a namespace. We use the interface keyword instead of the class keyword, and we're going to put our interface here. And then the stuff that we put inside the interface, what it ends up being is it's just a bunch of like signatures, basically. It gives you the footprint of what you want. So for instance, here's my create table of contents method that I'm saying you must implement. Because notice, I don't actually implement, you don't implement anything in your interface. You just define the signature of it. There's not even any curly braces there. So what you're doing, you give your doc block, and you give what the expectation is. Like this one actually doesn't take any arguments, but this one does take an argument. So this is a form of documentation. This is the contract, but there's no logic that goes in here. And that's what makes an interface so simple to read, because you don't, like, they're short. Even if you got tons of methods, it ends up being really short, and most of it is comments in your doc block. So people can understand, like, oh, that's what this thing is supposed to do. I get what this service is right now. So let's look at the other methods that I've defined in my interface right now. So then we've got the get next slide and the get previous slide and get slide images. So one of the things that I think I could actually improve with this module is you notice that when I go for my images, I have to keep escaping out of it, and then I go to the next image. And it would be kind of nice to actually have something where, like, when you were on an image, you would have a previous image and a next image. So that would be another thing that I would then put into my interface and say, oh yeah, if you think you're going to be so sharp and you're going to make your presentation manager, you're also going to have to implement methods that allow people to get to, you know, in between the images. I haven't coded it now, so I don't have it in the interface. But that would be an example of something new that I would want to add here. It's like, yeah, we need to have get previous image and get next image as well to make this actually easier to use when you're doing presentations, so I don't have to keep escaping out of it to move on to the next piece.
Do those dot block comments, does PHP actually execute it, or is it more like developer notes?
So that's actually an interesting question, and the answer is yes to both of them. Yes, they're documentation, yes, and they get executed, but there's a special way because that's annotations actually. And we will look at annotations in here. Those doc blocks, it still does, like, they still will pick up the things, like the api.drupal.org documentation is built entirely out of the stuff that goes into doc blocks. And so the doc blocks are still actually parsed so that it can create, you know, you could create some type of documentation on it. So it's documentation, it can get parsed so that it can get turned into like an API type of a thing, and once you get into annotations, it actually is, it's like code, it's functionality that you add. And so we'll see more of that in upcoming slides. Okay, so I said the way that we make our service is that we define this class, and we do our interface with the interface keyword. So let's talk about classes a little bit more. In PHP, the way you implement inheritance is that you extend a class. When you're going to create anything that gets instantiated, you create a class. So you use this class keyword, and you name your class, and you've got methods in the class, and you can have properties in the class. And then you instantiate that class to create an object. Okay? But PHP is single inheritance. You can't extend more than one class. But the way you get the properties or the methods from other classes is that you extend that class. Okay, so that's what we've got going on with classes right now. And you can have the complete ancestry tree you can extend a class that's extended another class that's extended. So it can go all the way back, and you inherit all that stuff, but you only get this one extend statement that you get to use with your classes. So, for instance, to make this modal work, it needs to have some type of endpoint that gets put into a modal. And so I have got a class that needs to actually be this thing that displays this image that gets put in the modal. And so I've created this display slide image class. And it's a controller because it's basically building a page. And so what I do is I extend the controller base. And now I've inherited a bunch of stuff from the controller base that's going to mean that I don't actually have to write as much code in my own class to get it to do the things that it needs to do. So here I'm extending the controller-based class because I wrote a controller to display the page. So there you see an example of inheritance being used. Okay, great. So I said I was going to talk about classes as well as abstract classes, and let's talk about abstract classes right now, because we've talked about interfaces, we've talked about classes, but we haven't talked about abstract classes. So one thing that you should know about an abstract class that's different from a class is that you can't actually instantiate an abstract class. You can't make an object out of it. There's no way to do it. In order to instantiate any abstract class, you have to have a concrete class, is what you would call it, that extends that abstract class, and then you instantiate that object that extends it, okay? So that's a limitation of an abstract class, is that you don't actually instantiate it. And it doesn't give you any magic that now you can extend more than one abstract class. It's still single inheritance. So those are limitations. And I didn't actually need to use an abstract class for my presentation module that I wrote, and I didn't want to force something in because I want this to be a real working example. So what we're going to end up having to do is we're going to take a look at where Drupal is using some abstract classes, so you can get a better idea of, wait, what are you talking about now? Like, what do you even do with this thing here? I don't get it. Let's look at some actual code examples. So you don't worry about understanding every single thing on the page and remembering everything. I'll highlight the things that you want to look. So what we're going to take a look at is Drupal has got this abstract class that it's defined that's called a list item base, which, as you can see, it also extends another class and it implements an interface. And it doesn't really matter whether this is a concrete class or this is an abstract class. It's extending a class. But pay attention to the list item base. That's what we're going to come back to. That's the abstract class we're looking at. And if we look inside of that abstract class, we're going to see there's a bunch of methods. And some methods actually have some code in the curly brace. So this is a difference between an abstract class and an interface. An interface doesn't define any logic at all. It just defines your doc block and your signature that you need to have, what arguments are you expecting. There's no code in there at all. So this is why you would use an abstract class instead of using an interface, because you might want your abstract class to actually define some methods that could be inherited by something else. So you'll see methods inside of an abstract class. And so you may see some methods that they're just like, okay, these are just regular methods that I'm going to see here. And those methods may be used straight up by classes that extend this abstract class. They might not change them at all. They'll just be pulled right in and they're going to be used. Something like get possible values is a method that the way it looks at your there's this, okay? That's a keyword that's used in the object-oriented programming. Like, it works the same for all of your objects. So this is an example of a method that just gets used straight up. We don't override it. We don't have to define it. We just use it in a class. And we're good to go. And same thing like with getting the possible options. Like, it just you work with the way that these interfaces are defined, and you just do the thing that you need to do. So there's some things that are just going to work that you use right as the way they're defined in that abstract class. And there are other things that aren't defined at all, or you may override. So, for instance, this allowed values description. there's no way that this abstract class is going to know what your possible descriptions of things are. So it can't even give you a sample implementation here because it's so dependent on what you're going to have. So what we've done here is we put this abstract keyword in front of this method, and that's kind of like what happens in an interface. When we're defining things, it's like, we don't have any idea how this is going to be done, but what we're telling you is, if you're going to extend this abstract class, you must implement this method. You have to give me a definition for this. Otherwise, PHP is going to complain. So here's something that you have to put that in your own class to make it work. And then you may see another type of method that would be along the lines like, you see this is casting something as a value. This might work, but you might not totally like the way it works. So you're going to end up overriding it inside of your class, and you're going to do something more specific with this. So we've seen the three different types. Some that are just going to be used straight up, you just take them. Some don't have anything defined, you have to actually implement it. And some, you might say, it's close, but I want it to do something a little bit different, so I'm going to override that. That's what we had in our abstract class. We looked at some of the methods. So now let's see something that actually uses that abstract class. Remember, our abstract class was called list item base. What we're doing now is we're writing a concrete class that's called list string item that's going to extend the list item base. So now this isn't any old type of item, it is a string type of item. And then you're going to see what we end up doing with these methods inside of this class that extends it. Well, the things that it uses straight up don't even appear in there. So I can't show you things that don't exist inside of this class. They inherited it. So I can show you the things that we actually did do. Well, Drupal did. I didn't do it. I didn't write this. But here's where the allowed values description that was that abstract method that we had defined in there that had nothing in it. Here's where we actually implement that. We say, here's what you're supposed to return for your allowed values description. Here's the specifics of what I'm allowing you to do here. So here's the implementation of that. If you recall the cast method, we say, well, yeah, you were actually supposed to be casting your value as something. And in your cast allowed value method, you didn't actually cast it as anything. You just returned the value. Here's where I'm telling you how to cast that value. You're casting it as a string. So here's where we're overriding the method. So that's abstract methods in use within Drupal 8. Does that make sense? Is that good? Again, like, I don't expect that you're going to walk out of here being master at this, but you're getting exposed to it, and you're going to see these types of patterns. So don't sweat if some of this, it still is kind of fire hose, even in an hour's presentation. It's a lot that I'm throwing at you. But it'll make more sense when you play with it, and you see it used all over the place. So you get a great opportunity to learn it by saying, oh, they're doing that there, and they're doing it there, and they're doing it, oh, now I get what it's doing. Okay, I mentioned traits earlier, and I said this is one of the things that is somewhat contentious in the PHP community. So let's talk about the traits now. You will hear people complain about them, but I think the general consensus is that they can be used well. And the fact of the matter is that they are used a lot in Drupal 8. So whatever the PHP community thinks of them, it's important for you to know what they are. And what they are is, as I mentioned, PHP is single inheritance. You can't inherit from multiple ancestors. You can run into a situation, and I actually have this with the module that I wrote, that I have a block that needs to generate a table of contents, and I've got a controller that needs to generate a table of contents. The controller extends a controller base. The block extends a
Block base.
Block base, right. Where am I supposed to put this method that I inherit now? Like, it's the same thing. Well, I don't want to put it in both spots. Do not repeat yourself. Keep it dry. What do we do about this? I can't have something that extends both the block base and the controller base, but I got the same logic that I want to use. You put it in a trait. A trait is a tool that we use to help overcome the fact that PHP is a single inheritance language. So where you end up having some of these things that you really need to use in more than one spot, and it didn't make sense to put that method into this one class, you know, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't type of situations. Like, wait a minute, if I put it in this class, then that means in order to get to it, I need to have something that extends that class. But you might have a case where you can't. One's a controller and one's a block base. But you may also have a situation like, but like that's too much. I don't really need to extend all of that class. Traits help you out of this type of a problem. It gives you a way that you can reuse your code. So it's very simple to declare a trait. You've got the keyword that's called trait. You make your trait, and you're going to put stuff inside of the trait there. So let's see what we've got in my trait. What I put in my trait is this build method. You can call your method whatever you want. It's possible for you to override not only your trait name when you use it in a class, you could alias it. You can also alias the methods in there if you really wanted to. I called it build because the block base has a method that's called build. And so it's convenient for me to have my trait with the method named build, because now when I drop this method into my block, I've got my build method there, and it just sees it and it's able to use it. So that's why I named it build. And there's no, you can name whatever you want, and it's like when you're your controller, you might not have named a build, but there's nothing wrong with the name. It's perfectly descriptive, why not? So I created this build method. You can see it's actually making use of my presentation manager service. It's calling the create table of contents method, and then it's doing some stuff with it, okay? And so this is it's a fully defined method. It's building a render array, and it's returning a render array. Question?
So you're using the keyword this
Yes.
in the context of something that is not a class. So in this case, that this is going to refer to whatever object the trait becomes part of, regardless of what class it
Right.
is.
So the trait itself is not compiled. Okay? The trait is basically just like, it's a code snippet. And you can think of it like when you do your require or your require once in PHP, what PHP ends up doing is, as it's going to go through your source code, your files, and it's going to interpret it, and it's going to compile it, when it sees that type of thing, what it basically does is it grabs it, and it copies and pastes it right into the location. So it's the exact same thing as when you do a require or a require once. It grabs some code, it drops it into the place wherever that is, and now it interprets that code, and it compiles it along with whatever object it's reading at that point. So the trait itself isn't compiled independently. So that's absolutely true. What you think about when you're writing your traits, it's like, oh, let me pretend that it actually exists in the place where I'm going to be using that trait, so I can think about, like for instance, I'm using a presentation manager. It's not just the this keyword, it's that I'm referring to this presentation manager service. But if you actually look at this trait, if you go to the repository, I don't have dependency injection. Like, I'm not injecting the presentation manager service into the trait anywhere. It actually gets injected into my class that uses the trait.
So this is a little bit dangerous because you could include this trait into a class that doesn't have a presentation manager service property.
It doesn't have, it doesn't have that.
You could just blow up.
Yeah, it doesn't have that service. It doesn't have a property that you refer to. Because I've used traits in other situations as well. Like, what I needed to do in this one project that I'm on is that they have this concept of, like when you build a page, it's built very similar, except you needed something to be a little bit different. And so what they ended up having, this was actually for porting the link checker module to Drupal 8. So the link checker has this reports page that you can go to, and you can have the report generated by user, or you can have the report generated in general. And so the trick that they did with the way they wrote is like, oh, there's this query that you write that's gonna pull whether it's just for a specific user or not. So what I actually ended up doing is I created, the query ends up being one of my properties that's in the trait. And then what I actually do is in my constructor that uses that trait, that's where I actually put something into that query. But since it's in the trait, now I can just, inside that trait, because this trait is what actually generates the page by the time that you're done. So the trait knows that it's got access to this query property, and it's just going to use it in there. But the query is actually built someplace else. So yes, you need to be careful about it, that if you cross your wires, that the trait's going to, but PHP is going to throw an error. They're going to say undefined, whatever, undefined this or undefined that. So yes, you could think of it. It can be somewhat dangerous. It's not like when you have an interface where it's enforced that Drupal is going to tell you, like, you haven't defined this method, and that's in the interface here, and you've signed that contract. You could end up with something like that. But it's not going to take you too long to run across it, because you're going to try to run something, and it's going to throw the error. How you use a trait is that you just put it inside the class, and you say use. And so what ends up happening is, like, pow! This snippet of code is just dropped right into place, and now it gets compiled with the rest of your object. So it's as if I have those lines of code that defines that build method right then. And now there you have it. So you've got code reuse right now, very simple to use.
So
yeah.
Does it do anything else besides provide like an include or require? Is it just syntactic sugar on top of that?
That's all it is. It's just a trait gives you a place that you can hold a snippet of code that you can then include in some other code.
What if that trait is using a method name that's already defined in that class?
Oh, okay. Let me go back to this. So let's say that you had a class, and for whatever reason, your class already had the build method. What you can do when you use a trait, and I didn't actually need to do this, when you use a trait, you can alias the name of the trait itself, because sometimes what you end up having is that you can have kind of name collisions with your trait. And this happens in Drupal. You can see examples of this in Drupal, where they're using a trait, and they alias the trait. It says, like, use trait as. It's like if you're familiar, if you guys write, MySQL statements, when you're aliasing things. So do something as, you do that same thing. So you use the trait as, so you can alias your trait name, but then what you can also do is, like what I did with mine, I just said to use the trait. So pretend that we had this build method was already in use in one of my classes. So where I would say use table of contents trait, then I could actually do like another set of curly braces, and then the method names in there, you can do the same thing, where you say the method as, and then you give it another method name. So then you're able to, you've aliased the method name, so you're able to have your method name take precedence over the trait's method name, because you've now actually aliased the trait's method name, and so you refer to it with the alias name at that point.
So would you get a runtime error?
There.
Well,
there's also the thing, like, what happens if you're using more than one trait, and some of the traits have the same thing. So there actually is, you'd have to go on php.net. They actually explain the hierarchy and the precedence of how we decide which one we're going to pull from based on this situation and who's going to win out in where there's a conflict. So there is like a sequence that it goes through to decide which one wins. So it's not going to just blow up. But it's maybe not going to do what you want it to do, because it's using something different than what you're expecting. Was there another question? Yeah.
Where do you put your trait file with PSR4?
Oh, the trait goes like right under your source folder. Yeah, because so I didn't. If you look at, like if you look in the repository, in order to be able to use this trait inside of the class, to use that use statement, there's use statements that you have at the top of your classes as well that kind of declares the namespaces. And so you'll see like where I'm saying that I'm going to use that table of contents trait. And if you look at the namespace that I give there, once you understand like how Drupal has implemented PSR4, by the way, PSR4 isn't anything that's magical that guarantees where everything is going to be. You still have to use, like, there's these autoloader functions, and you still, if you look at Drupal, it actually explains this is where you look for things when you use this certain namespace in here. And so where Drupal puts it, the trait goes right under your source folder that's in your modules directory. Okay, let's look at, so Jonathan asked about the doc block, and I said we're going to come back to it. And here's where we're coming back to it right now. If you paid attention to some of the slides that I've showed you here, and I didn't actually talk about it because it sort of like pop up there, and I talked about something else, and then I moved on to something. But if you looked at something like, what's like all this? There's this @ sign, and there's these curly braces there. Like, what is the deal in that doc block there? So if you notice that, what you noticed, they're called annotations. That was that funny code. And if you didn't notice it, that's okay, because we're going to look at an example here, and you'll get a chance to see it. But annotations are things that are, they look like comments because they're in the doc block, but they're like code, basically. And Drupal makes use of annotations in the plugin system so that you can define things about your plugins. And so so this is one of the things that, like, when you are making certain changes to some of your classes, you need to get Drupal to rescan your directory so it will see some of these things that you put in the annotations so that it actually then kind of compiles that stuff and puts it into the registry. Annotations are providing you functionality on your site. And plugins make a ton of use of annotations. A lot of stuff is done in annotations with your plugins. So let's look at it. Let's look at an annotation. I mentioned that I've got there's these blocks that I've got that are showing my thumbnails of the slides. A block is a plugin. And so what I've done is I've done an annotation to define, in mine is an @block annotation because I'm using the block plugin. So you've got your annotation type. The admin label in the category, that's just like informational purposes. When you go into the block layout interface, you'll see these things show up in the block interface, that little modal that comes up, okay? The ID is like your machine name that you would give blocks when you were working with blocks before, okay? But the really cool part of this block that I wrote and the annotation key that I used is this context key. If you built in Drupal 8 before, you know blocks don't have a way to accept arguments. And so the way that you would do things, like when you're building views, is you say, I'm going to come into the advanced area and I'm going to give an argument, a contextual filter, sorry. I'm going to create this contextual filter, and in my contextual filter, I'm going to provide a default value, and I'm going to grab the ID, the content ID from the URL. And this is how a block is able to figure out, like, oh, this is the node that's on the page here because I've gotten this default argument passed in via the contextual filter. This is where we come up with the notion of context. Now you can have context-aware plugins, and so I'm using a context in my annotation that's going to let me know what is the node that's being displayed on this page. So just keep in mind, I have this annotation here. That's all I've got in this block, and it magically makes this method available to me so that I can pull the contents of whatever node is being displayed on the page. So that's not just a comment there. That's like serious functionality that you're getting by using this annotation. And how we use it is that later on in the code, I now have this method that's called getContextValue. And in the key, I said the context that I wanted was the node context. So I'm saying get this node context. And when I do that, I actually get the fully loaded node object. I didn't have to do anything with dependency injection. I didn't have to implement another interface. Like, all I did is I put this annotation at the top of my block, and then later on in the code, I'm like, dude, I'm ready for a node. Hand it to me. And now I got it. So it's kind of mind-blowing, you know, that like, it gets parsed. But this is, remember this, though, because you will frustrate yourself if you forget about the fact, like, oh, right, yeah, I changed something in my annotations, and now I need to get Drupal to parse that again. And so you need to get Drupal. The way that I do this, I haven't fooled around figuring if you do it in Drush or not. When I change things, I just have a habit. I go back to the extend page, because when you go to the extend page, it gets Drupal to scan your directories again, and it gets it to rebuild certain things in there, and then I clear cache. So if you're doing things and you're running into problems like, why is this not working? If you're dealing with annotations, you have to get Drupal to scan that again so that it parses it again. Clearing cache alone doesn't do it, okay? There's nothing new for it to put in there yet. You have to get it to scan your code again so that it can do some of this stuff. So pretty darn cool, the functionality that you can get with that. Annotations are super powerful. All right, I've mentioned dependency injection a ton at this point. So let's finally look at it. I'm going to say there's 3 different ways that you do dependency injection. They're not really 3 different ways. There's basically like 2 different ways, but 3 is a cooler number than 2. And they're sort of different. You can do dependency injection using services. You can do dependency injection using a container interface, and you can do dependency injection using a container factory plugin interface. The 2 that are really the same is the container interface and the container factory plugin interface, because at the end of the day, it ends up being the same. And if you really wanted to criticize me about is you can say that all three of them are actually basically the same thing. But let's look at the three examples anyway. So when we write a service, if we want to get access to another service, if we want to inject a service into our service, we do this through the services.yaml file, and we've got this arguments that we put there, and then we use this @ sign, and that's because you can actually also inject parameters, which you use a % sign to do that. So we're saying we want to inject the entity type manager service, and I needed to do it. Remember, like this is a working module. This isn't hypothetical. I needed the entity type manager services from within my presentation manager service. So I went into my services.yaml file. That's where you declare your services. That's how Drupal knows you've written a service. And I've told it, by the way, my service needs an entity type manager service. That's one method of getting at another service. And if we do that, you will see in my presentation manager service, in my constructor function, there you go. Symfony passes in the entity type manager service, and then I put it in one of my protected properties here, and then I use that later on in the code. I do stuff with the node storage. That's example number 1. Example number 2. I have a controller that extends the controller base. And one of the things that the controller base implements is the container interface. And so what I have inside of my controller is I know that there's going to be this create method, and I call this create. This create method will be called by Symfony, and Symfony knows to call that method because I'm implementing an interface. And because I'm implementing that interface, it knows that method exists there. So by extending this controller base that implements this, I'm forgetting the name now because I'm thinking container factory plugin interface, because we actually have to say that explicitly with blocks. But it's the container dependency injection container interface. It's being implemented in the controller base class. And so I've got my create method. In my create method, that's where I tell Symfony, when you call my constructor, I want you to pass me these things. And so I'm saying, in this situation, for my controller that's building my table of contents page, I need my presentation manager service. And so I'm telling Symfony, when you call my constructor, pass in my presentation manager service. And you'll notice that you type hint it using this interface here. Don't type hint it using this specific class name, because now you just ruined dependency injection in the ability to do the unit testing, because you basically now hard-coded things. If you're concerned, yeah, but Mark, you're hard-coding it here too. Like, what's the big deal, dude? It's just a convenient way that we interact with the dependency injection container, but Drupal does provide you with a way that you can tweak in your own services.yaml file, that in your site default files, that says, oh, by the way, when they say they want the presentation manager service, I really want you to use my substitution for that presentation manager service. So it's not truly hard-coded in here, but you have to give some way that you tell Symfony, this is what I want to have injected back into this class that I'm defining, okay? So it's pluggable. It really does work, okay? And the magic happens because you're using an interface, and anything that implements that interface is fair game. You can bring it in, and when you're doing unit testing, you can totally mock that object as well, okay? That's another advantage, that since you're using these interfaces here in dependency injection, you get to mock certain things, which is what makes unit testing possible. All right. So blocks, the block base doesn't implement any interface that allows you to do dependency injection. So this is the third way that I'm saying that we do things. When you have a block that needs to get access to services, you just tell your block to implement the container factory plugin interface. And then once you do that, you've got the same ability to use this create method that Symfony will call, and then you tell it, this is my block that builds the table of contents. It says, I need the presentation manager service. Inject that into me via my constructor. So that's the three ways that you can do dependency injection. Where dependency injection is actually happening is in the constructor. This is dependency injection right here. It's passing the needed objects that you're going to work with into your constructor. That's all the dependency injection is. You can think of it in terms of procedural code. It's like passing an argument into a function. That's all that is happening with dependency injection. Okay, but it's powerful. It makes unit testing possible. It makes the swapping things out possible. So it's a simple concept that gives you lots of power when you are writing things. Okay, how do we actually get to anything now? Like my controller, how did I make that front page? How do you get there? You have to have a path to get to it. And what you do is you use a routing file. This is the hook menu function used to do a ton of different things. Things have been split out. The separation of concerns is another pattern that's used in Drupal 8. Let's not have one thing do everything. Let's have one thing do one thing really well. And so what used to be part of hook menu now becomes a routing file. And what you do in your routing file is you define your paths. So this is my route name. I can name it whatever I want. This is the path that you're going to go to. Presentation/table of contents, and the thing that's going to take care of that is my controller, and you're going to call my build method on my controller, and then I also created another controller that is what populates the page that's displayed in the modal. I'm using Drupal 8's modal API here, and so you can see you still have the ability to pass arguments into your route name as well, and you can do dynamic routes as well. Actually, I had a colleague ask me the other day, I need to do this type of thing. It's like, oh. All right, well, you need to do dynamic routes. That's one of those types of things that's a special case. But here's a routing file. Okay, here's the path. Here's what's going to respond to that path when somebody goes to it to make whatever happen when you go there. All right, now let's look at libraries. And we're super close to being done here. For improving performance, rather than loading every single thing on every page, you create these asset libraries. Things that can go into libraries are like what CSS is going to be loaded on a page, what JavaScript is going to be loaded on a page, and you can also put like certain like the JavaScript settings inside of a library, and then you just attach those libraries when you need them. And all of that stuff goes into your libraries.yaml file. And I did actually need to make use of an asset library for the module that I wrote here. In my situation, this presentation, every single thing is a slide content type. But in theory, if you use this module on another site, maybe not everything would be a slide, and you don't want my JavaScript loaded on every single one of your pages. So that's in a library, and my JavaScript is managed by that library. So I created my library that I call presentation slide, and I'm saying, oh, you know, when you attach this library, you're going to attach my JavaScript. And the JavaScript that I wrote is just the thing that gives the ability to click and reveal the items on the bulleted list, just to make it look more sort of like a typical PowerPoint presentation. So we don't need, and it's small, my JavaScript is pretty small, but it also does rely on jQuery and other stuff in the Drupal libraries there. And we don't want that loaded on every page. So I put it into a library, and I said, okay, this is my asset library that I'm going to use to manage this. And then we need to have a way that we can then attach that library in the times that we need it. So before I was able to do that, and this is how Twig came into play here, because I needed this library, and then plus you're getting to see an example of a .module file. So here was like the maybe last few minutes of the presentation where people have said, oh, you didn't really need to include that. You could have shortened up the presentation. I still think it's worthwhile knowing it. In Drupal 8, not everything is still object-oriented. Some things are still using procedural code, namely when we're dealing with hooks. And the hooks end up going on our .module file. And the reason I needed a hook in my .module file is that when you're dealing with a theme, your template suggestions are picked up automatically. Drupal will just pull that template in. But when you're dealing with a module, you actually need to use hook theme to tell that I need you to use this template suggestion. So I used hook theme. I'm saying I want you to use my node underscore slide, which translates into dash dash. Dashes get turned to underscores when you're converting between the templates and the names there, which is the same as it was in Drupal 7. I want you to use this node slide full template when you're displaying slides. And the reason I want you to display that template, we're going to look at that here, because I've done something with this Twig template. So really quickly, what Twig is, this is a theming system that we're using. It's basically the same as the .tpl.php files, except it's actually easier to use. It's very similar, but easier. And you can override it with theme suggestions the same ways you were doing before. And you are able to do debugging to figure out what template is actually in use on a page. And so what I had done when I needed to create my template here, I created this node slide full template, Inside that template, the only reason I needed it is that I needed to attach my library only when I was using that template. So only attach the library when I'm actually looking at the full node view of a slide. And now the pages are able to be lighter weight. And so that, let's see. I'm forgetting, I guess I'm showing you where I put my, this is where I'm mentioning that, like, if you wanted to override, this is where you can override your services here for, like, a presentation manager. But why was I highlighting the services file here? Oh, we go into the services file to turn on Twig debugging. And when we turn on Twig debugging, this is one of the things you can change in there, we're able to look at our page source. And when we look at our page, so we've turned on Twig debugging in our services YAML file. And when we turn on Twig debugging, what we're able to see in our code, our HTML code, if we view the page sources, here's the various templates that you could use on this page. And this is one is showing, and the one that I actually have in use right now is my node slide full. That has the X next to it. So this is one nice thing about Twig. You turn on the debugging and you get an idea of what your template suggestions are and how you might override your template. So that's what I did in my situation here. Before I had written my own template, I turned on Twig debugging, I looked at the page source, I said, oh yeah, I think node slide full is going to be a good option for me. And I used it, and that's what enabled me to attach my JavaScript library there. Okay, so I told you even with an hour it's going to be kind of fire hose. I'm happy to stick around. Come, I'll go out to lunch with you, whatever. Ask me. I love talking about this stuff. Come talk to me at camp. You can get in touch with me through the GitHub repository if you want to. Happy to answer more questions, help you out with this stuff here. I'm so glad that all of you were here. I hope you enjoyed the session. I hope it gets you really excited about Drupal 8 and that you would like to do it. You can file an issue on the repo for this presentation, or if you would rather go into Joined In and leave your feedback, let me know what you thought about it. There's the link that you can go on to Joined In. Please do let me know what you think about the module. Let me know what you think about the presentation. Give me your feedback. I want it to be as good as possible. Thank you.